Good morning. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to those of you who were around for the previous Analytical Corner. Welcome to this next Analytical Corner on debt in low-income countries. Before we get started, let me remind you to please silence your cell phones. Our presenter will speak for about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll follow it up with Q&A after that. So with that, let me quickly invite our presenter, Chuku. Please welcome him. Chuku.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Chuku, and I'm with the Debt Policy Division of the Strategy Policy and Review Department. I'd like to talk to you this morning about issues that are keeping policymakers and investors awake at night. And that issue is the debt challenges that low-income countries face and the urgent actions we need to take now to alleviate them. But you might ask, why are policymakers staying up at night and thinking about debt? It's not only because of the staggering economic cost of sovereign defaults and the complex and painful restructuring processes that follow. It's also because the hard-won development gains of the last 2 decades could be wiped out before our very eyes if we don't take actions now. Now, consider this sobering fact. Did you know that 10 years after a typical sovereign default, an average citizen in a defaulting country could suffer lifespan reduction of around 14 months? Yes, debt tolls could take such profound human toll on vulnerable groups. Now, since COVID, we've seen a surge in sovereign debt defaults among low-income countries and middle-income countries. Now, some experts are even saying that we are now at the brink of another sovereign debt, systemic debt crisis, the kind that we saw last in the 1980s and the 1990s that eventually triggered the heavily indebted Poor Countries Debt Relief Initiative. We will call that the HIPIC. So as a result, some are now calling for a second-generation HIPIC initiative. Some are even calling for a Brady-type solution, the kind that was used to bail out Mexico and other Latin American countries in the 1980s. They are concerned that the absence of a well-coordinated, globally accepted, and predictable path to debt restructuring could trigger a breakout of a cascading debt crisis in low-income countries. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to share with you some of the key highlights from a research that we worked on with my colleagues at the IMF, where we sought to answer 3 crucial questions. The first question is, what's the current state of debt vulnerabilities in low-income countries? And then secondly, how does today's debt vulnerabilities compare with the debt vulnerabilities in the pre-HIPIC period? And then finally, what are the actions that we need to take right now to alleviate the debt challenges in low-income countries? So let's start with the first question on the current state of debt vulnerabilities in low-income countries. Over the past decade, you would have noticed that there's been a sharp increase in debt levels. And this has been further exacerbated by the COVID shock, by the war in Ukraine, and the tightening of global financing conditions. Total public and publicly guaranteed debt as a share of GDP increased by an average of 1 percentage point since 2010 until 2019. And in 2020 alone, it jumped up by 13 percentage points due to COVID impacts. Now, as you see in the chart, this increase over the last decade is primarily driven by growth in 2 key components, domestic debt component and external non-concessional debt. Secondly, financing needs have jumped sharply for low-income countries, with financing terms becoming harsher and many countries now switching toward riskier instruments. Now, gross financing needs has jumped from about 4.5% of GDP in 2019 to about 10% on average for low-income countries. In some countries, actually up to 15%. And this is partly due to recovery-related spending, the increased interest payments, and more recently, the cost of living crisis from higher food and energy prices. Also, with the global tightening of credit, many low-income countries now face tougher borrowing terms, with shorter grace periods on new loans, and wider sovereign debt spreads, indicating adverse risk perception for low-income countries' asset class and investor flight to safety. So the financing apparatus has shifted toward riskier instruments. from private sector, including Eurobonds, collateralized loans, and syndicated loans from public and private partnerships. As a result, there is a lumpy bullet repayment coming due for most low-income countries within the next 3 to 5 years, partly explained by the surge in Eurobond issuances following the easy global financial conditions, in the aftermath of the global financing conditions. So to recap from this first section, we see that the current state of debt vulnerabilities, we can see that the succession of shocks has exacerbated already growing debt vulnerabilities in low-income countries over the last decade. Now, the last time we saw debt growing this fast with chronic structural challenges was in the early 1990s, which eventually triggered the HIPIC debt relief initiative in 1996. So the situation now begs at least two questions. So are low-income countries currently in a systemic debt crisis? Well, if the answer is yes, so do we need a second-generation HIPIC-style debt relief initiative today to deal with the challenges? Well, let's start with the first question and compare the debt burden indicators today with the debt levels in the pre-HIPIC era. Now, it's important to bear in mind that the framework for assessing debt sustainability has evolved over the years since the 1980s. What we did in this study is to apply the thresholds of the current low-income countries' debt sustainability framework retroactively to the pre-HIPIC era and today. Now, the advantage you get from that is that we have a common basis for comparing what the debt vulnerabilities were in the pre-HIPIC era and what they are today. Now, I'll invite you to take a look at the charts above, which provides a high-level summary of key insights from the comparison. In panel A, public and publicly guaranteed debt today is well below the level we saw in the mid-1990s, prior to the HIPIC era. In panel B, following the debt relief provided through HIPIC and multilateral debt relief initiative, arrears accumulation has remained subdued in most leaks since the 2000s. Now, the key conclusion is that high risk notwithstanding, low-income countries today remain less, debt vulnerabilities in low-income countries today remain less alarming on average than they were in the 1990s. Now, let's drill down further, separating the solvency and liquidity indicators. Both solvency indicators of external debt vulnerability, that is, external debt to GDP and external debt to export ratios, are about half their levels today compared to the level they reached in the pre-HIPIC era. Now, to be concrete, 38 out of about 60 leaks in the pre-HIPIC era had breached the 150% threshold for external debt to GDP ratio. Today, only 25 leaks, about 1/3 of them, are above the 150% mark. Now, on the liquidity side, the median leak in 1994 used about 18% of revenues to service debt. Today, they're spending about 10% of revenue to service debt, which is below the strictest threshold of 14% for countries with a weak debt carrying capacity in the leak DSF framework. Getting more granular, the distance to the thresholds on liquidity indicators are thin, and that's what you see in the chart on the screen. This situation is more acute for countries with a weak debt carrying capacity. Now, there are, however, two caveats I'd like you to bear in mind here. First, the weakness in data coverage, especially with the newer class of instruments, may mask greater risk and vulnerabilities today. Second, because our analysis doesn't fully capture the domestic debt service obligations, they're not fully captured in this analysis, so this might understate the total liquidity risk given their increasing importance. But we reckon that these factors are unlikely in principle to change our headline conclusion. Now, also, we are beginning to see circumstantial evidence that the debt overhang among low-income countries is beginning to kick in. Debt service as a percent of GDP is crowding out social spending among leaks. As you see in the chart, between the two lines that are beginning to narrow again between debt service and social spending. Now, to the third question. So, do we need a second-generation HIPIC-style initiative today? Well, I think the answer is no, and I'll explain why. First, the data suggests that we are not at the point where we were pre-HIPIC. But more than that, the current global financing architecture will make the reincarnation of HIPIC a much more difficult and challenging feat to accomplish today. The rebalancing of the creditor landscape makes creditor coordination much more difficult. Private creditors and non-Paris Club creditors have become larger creditors to low-income countries over the last decade, while senior multilateral creditors now account for about half of the credit exposure to low-income countries. Also, there's now a higher concentration of holdings by a few creditors. Pre-HIPIC, the top 5 creditors to low-income countries accounted for 60% of debt to leaks. But today, the top 5 creditors account for 75%, thereby making it easier for one country to hold out and stop any restructuring process. Third, there seems to be, some of the non-Paris Club creditors that have become more relevant include China and India, Saudi Arabia, and they have displaced Paris Club creditors from the top 5 creditor lists, thereby diversifying the creditor base. Third, there seems to be official sector donor fatigue in the midst of private sector lending vigor. Net transfers to low-income countries has dropped from about 8% of GDP in the 1980s to less than 2% of GDP today. And that could be a sign of the low appetite for a similarly styled HIPIC-type initiative today. Moreover, calls for international financial institutions to provide the kind of debt relief that was given through the HIPIC and MDRI could be counterproductive, as it could imply crowding out scarce resources that could otherwise be used to scale up concessional lending to low-income countries. So I'd like to conclude with the news headlines from the paper. Now, first, the good news is that high risk notwithstanding, low-income countries are currently not in a systemic debt crisis of the type we saw last in the mid-1990s and in the 1980s. However, the bad news is that if current trends persist and if the right policies and actions are not taken, then low-income countries might well be in the same situation we saw in the last episode in the 1990s and be in a systemic debt crisis. So the window to prevent another systemic debt crisis is closing fast, and we all need to take actions now to avert it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Chuku. Okay, I will turn to your questions shortly, but I'd imagine a lot of you have at least one question in mind, because you ended your presentation with, if we don't take action now, we might be heading towards a crisis. Well, I'm sure people would like to know, what are those actions?
Thank you, Amit. I think that's the important point. What are the actions that policymakers and the international creditor community can take today to avoid another systemic debt crisis? And we can organize this in 2 buckets. Let's think about one bucket about the actions that authorities, policymakers can take now. And in the other bucket, we have the actions that the international creditor community and the international financial institutions can take. So on the first bucket, what authorities can do today, I'll say it's prevention, because prevention is better than cure. Actually, our director in the Strategy Policy and Review Department, Jela, you popularized the statement that there are 3 kinds of debt. There's bad debt, there's good debt, there's bad debt, and there's ugly debt. So what authorities need to do is to prevent the accumulation of bad debt and ugly debt. Well, you might say, what's bad debt, what's ugly debt? Bad debt is debt that is not invested in the right projects, debt that is taken for consumption purposes to pay salaries and so on. And ugly debt is worse. It's debt that eventually gets leaked and siphoned to line private pockets, maybe outside of the shores. So first is prevention, prevent the accumulation of bad and ugly debt. Secondly, we can think about a low-hanging fruit, domestic resource mobilization. And if countries can apply the right policies, they could increase domestic resource mobilization. And by the way, low-income countries, about 2/3 of low-income countries have tax to GDP ratios less than 15% of GDP. And recent research in the fund, in the IMF, shows that there is another 8 to 9% of untapped tax to GDP ratio that is just low-hanging fruit on the floor that authorities with the right policies could explore and reap the harvests of domestic resource mobilization to reduce the pressures. And because debt problems are unique to countries in different ways, I will say that countries should continue to diligently and steadfastly implement the clinical policy recommendations in the context of IMF surveillance programs and in the context of IMF engagement in surveillance and program context. So that's the one bucket. Now, on the other bucket, where we have the international financial institutions and the global creditor community, I think one action that can be taken now could be to crash the cost of financing to low-income countries. And the way we could crash that is to make long-term concessional financing abundant. There should be an abundant supply of long-term concessional financing. That way, low-income countries can borrow cheaper and facilitate the transition to a greener economy. The global creditor community could also ex ante provide debt service suspension. So if we see that the country is sinking, we don't have to wait until the country sinks fully before we try to bail the country out. Once the crisis starts to set in, we could provide ex ante, before the crisis starts, debt service suspension. And finally, the wheel for the process of debt restructuring needs more greasing in the wheels. And thankfully, there's good news. The common framework is beginning to work, is working fast, is moving faster. And there's consensus building with the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which is helping creditors to work together, different stakeholders in this. So I think if we can put these actions together, we can avoid another systemic debt crisis among low-income countries in the medium to near term. Yeah.
Thank you, Chuku. Okay, now let me turn to your questions. We'll have colleagues walking around with microphones. Here, third row, please. Sir, if you don't mind, introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Dastan. I came from Kyrgyzstan. I wanted to turn that debt issue to a little bit different direction. You didn't touch that area concerning climate or noise debt swap nature or debt swap climate. Which kind of policies are there? Can you elaborate? Because now there's a lot of demand on it, right? How to reduce debt level at the same time to increase climate resilience, especially in developing countries. In other areas, recently, Managing Director of IMF announced that 100 million SDR will distribute for developing countries in order to tackle climate, if I'm not mistaken, change, right? And can you elaborate on that policy as well? Which kind of expectation and which kind of policies which can be expected from developing countries? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, I'll come back to you, sir. So two-part question. One's on climate, the intersection of debt and climate, and the other one's on the 100 billion, which I believe that's a G20 target, if I'm not mistaken, but please.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. So on the question on rechanneling SDR 100 billion SDR, I think that's an operational question. Since it's not part of this research, I'll say that there'll be forums where maybe in the debt seminar where you could raise that question. But if we can focus on low-income countries and on debt, by the way, so one of the actions we said we could take is to abundantly supply long-term, concessional financing to low-income countries, and that could help, facilitate the transition to greener economy, the adaptation and the mitigation efforts that will help. Yep.
And actually, if I can just add one more thing too, there is a seminar I believe we have on Thursday that focuses precisely on this topic, which is how do countries in today's day and age, when they're facing such difficult circumstances, how can they actually do both, right? What are the options countries have to do some transformational reforms and how that intersects with your climate question? I believe that's on Thursday at 2, if I'm not mistaken. Sir, you had a question. Microphone right up here, please. If you could stand up and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Charles Chilufia from the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network Africa. Something that you touched on that is very important is domestic resource mobilization. And one of the major headwinds against that is tax evasion, which amount to anything like 80 or 90 billion every year away from Africa to the north. What more should be done? That's urgent. What should we do to curtail that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Charles. I think that's an important point. So, as we say, there's so much, there's between 8 to 9% on tax revenue just hanging in low-income countries. And there's a lot of tax avoidance and evasion in many low-income countries. Now, one strategy could be to try to digitize the tax system. That way you can track better who is paying and what amounts they're paying and what they're paying rightly, and to broaden the net to capture more of the production in the economy, and to cut down on exceptions that are granted to ostensible spending. So I think there's a lot of scope, depending on the country context, to prevent tax avoidance. And that's why we said in the context of IMF surveillance programs, we have those clinical policy recommendations that will be directed to specific country circumstances to address this kind of specific issues and how it's related to the different countries. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions. The gentleman there in the middle, sir, if you could stand up, yes, and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bode Shonibare from First Bank of Nigeria. So you mentioned, I guess, that the study kind of excluded local debt. And I guess by the pie chart, there was obviously, there's a lot of external financing. Does that possibly increase the vulnerabilities to global external shocks, given that, most of the financing from these for these low-income countries comes externally, and what, efforts could possibly be done to increase increase local debt-raising capabilities?
Thank you, Wale. So actually, that's part of domestic resource mobilization. Developing the local capital markets is part of what authorities could do to help to reduce the pressure to borrow externally. But yes, we mentioned that caveat that we don't fully capture domestic debt service obligations, because we're using the framework, the LEAK DSF framework, which mostly focuses on external debt. But what we think is that even if we add, because we did some robustness tests in the study, even after we add possibly domestic debt-related obligations, the overall conclusions will not change. We'll still be in a situation today that is less alarming than it was in the 1990s. But I agree with you, over the last 2 decades, domestic debt component has increased threefold in most low-income countries. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I have time for one more question only. I'm getting flashing signals. Gentleman back there, please. If you could, yes.
So, Ragid Mughrabi, American University of Beirut, finance lecturer. For single resource countries, we'll give Ghana as an example on the cocoa, within the cocoa field. With economic diversification, could the IMF come in and say, okay, here's we can at least help you from an external debt side, obviously, diversify your economy, whether it's service sectors and so on. Are things that granular at that micro level with respect to the discussions with various countries that have the single commodity risk profile?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is whether can the IMF help with so is the question on policy advice, or was the question? Okay, on policy advice.
I think, yeah, so, I mean, you made an example of Ghana and other countries that might be, monostructured. They have single, maybe cocoa exports. And yes, IMF advice actually gets that granular, and that's why we kept going back to this clinical. Why we say clinical? Because it's specific to the country's problems. And in that context, IMF recommendations in the context of surveillance and program engagements would specify usually where the pain points are and what needs to be done to alleviate those problems. But yes, policies usually gets granular, and that's why we are not recommending a kind of wholesale, one-size-fits-all kind of debt relief initiative. It's more like a country-by-country specific tailored restructuring processes, and we think that's what's working for most countries given the unique circumstances they face.
And maybe if I could just add one thing, so the fund not only does policy advice, we actually do capacity development around the world, and we've got about 17 centers which does precisely, it's not only telling them what to do, but actually working with them on how. Okay, I'm sorry, that's all the time we have for questions. But before I close, Chuku, could I ask you to just summarize your key message before we close?
Yeah, thanks, Amit. I think the key message I'd like for us to take away with is that we shouldn't panic. Low-income countries are not currently in a systemic debt crisis. But then we should continue to be vigilant and be steadfast in applying the policy actions that are needed to avert another debt crisis in low-income countries. And secondly, I'd like to encourage you, those of you that might have time tomorrow, there'll be much more deeper, higher-level discussion on debt in a seminar where the MD and a very renowned panel will be discussing more issues on debt. So if you have time, I'll encourage you to also attend that seminar. Thank you for your engagement.
Thank you. Before we close, just a reminder that we have another analytical corner starting in 5 minutes, and that will be on tracking trade disruption from space. So please stay right there, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.